Good evening, everybody. It's really good to be with you. I am normally not nervous when I speak, but for some reason I am tonight. And I think it's because of the significance of this conversation and this discussion. When Marissa reached out to me originally, I was going to speak about the history of racism in religion, which I would dare say I'm probably a little more comfortable with, being an ordained clergy, and I was kind of looking forward to talking about Cotton Mather and the Puritans and all of that. And then when she said, well, how about February 4th? And I looked at, and I saw Angela Davis, and I thought, my God, that's daunting. I mean, she's extraordinary. And so I feel completely humbled by that. And honored to be here. And tonight I mainly just want to share with you some reflections on what it's like to be in local government right now, not only in our city, but within the context of where we are as a nation and as a world, and to talk about some of the intersections that I'm experiencing personally and in my work. So part of what I want to talk about tonight is intersectional theory, which if you read this last section, you saw a little bit of that by Kimberly Crenshaw, who really founded this concept when she was 30 years old as a professor. A little bit more context around this. I just returned from taking what's called a hybrid class at Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia. Ironically, the ground on which Columbia Theological Seminary is situated used to be the home to slaves. And they have been struggling a lot in the last few years around the issue of racism, historic racism, and how it keeps showing up systemically in their institution as a theological seminary. So being on campus and being a part of that discussion has been pretty extraordinary. But the class that I took was called The History of Race and Migration in the Making of the American Church. And so we started with Puritanism, with the whole concept of colonialization or colonization, and how over the course of history, the church has really supplemented, added to this history of racism, sometimes very intentionally and sometimes very unintentionally. But finding where I kind of fit into that flow and particularly reading this last section where I fit into that has been really fascinating. So I'm just going to meander through some of that tonight, and hopefully will make a little bit of sense. One of the things that I believe in very passionately is the power of love. And I think love at its core is about seeking justice. And it's about having the courage to seek justice even when it's uncomfortable. It's about seeking justice and not being afraid to fail in the process, but also in seeking justice not to expect others who have been marginalized or oppressed or excluded to have the responsibility to teach me or to teach us. I've got to do that work. All of us have to do that work in a way that we need to do it. And so all of that for me is within this context of love and what it means to honor and celebrate each other and to recognize each other's integrity within this whole process of discovery. So I mentioned a little earlier intersectional theory or intersectional theology, and this work, this theory has a bent toward justice. So if you want to get involved in intersectional theory, you've just got to recognize that it's going to be about justice and seeking justice. One of my classmates in this last class that I took at seminary is formerly Southern Baptist. And in one of her posts, she described a speech that was given at a recent Southern Baptist convention, which essentially took apart, piece by piece, intersectional theory or theology, and sought to do so on biblical grounds. And as she reflected on it, she also reflected how everything that this person was doing, this white male, was doing in his effort was racist at core. And so it really created this dilemma and this challenge within her own theological reflection, but I found it very helpful that she shared it with us. So part of intersectional theory or theology is about looking at life, at experience, at the way we analyze situations from multiple social locations, identities, and institutions that shape not only our individual experience, but our collective experience within systems of power and privilege. And Vivian May, who's also done a lot of work in this, goes on to say, in other words, intersectionality is a lens for understanding how gender, race, social class, sexual identity, and other forms of difference work concurrently to shape people and social institutions within multiple relationships of power. Some of my social locations and some of the places of intersection in my life are these. I'm gay. I'm a father. I'm a husband, and I have a husband. I'm a grandpa. I'm white. I have privilege. I have power. I experience being marginalized by my sexual orientation. I'm a chaplain. I'm a Christian. I'm a community outreach coordinator for a local elementary school. I'm the vice mayor for our city. I'm a theologian. I believe in equality and equity in transforming the way we honor and live with one another in community. And I could probably name some other points of social location or identity, but those are some of the places that I come from. One of the exercises we explored in this class that I took was imagining a table. And for whatever reason, our professor, Dr. William Yu, who is Asian American and a teacher of history, he invited us to imagine a table with 5 seats at the table. He said if we looked historically at the making of the American church, those 5 seats then, and in some ways now, would be filled with white, male Protestants. And so we began talking about how through that history and through our history as a nation, we seek to change the people who are seated at that table, because that changes the conversations that we have. It brings forward different social locations, different identities, different explorations. So we could take a topic, racism, and we could have 5 very different people from 5 very different social locations. So if we were just to read back through this last section, based on our reading, think about 5 people that we read about who you think you would find interesting and challenging to have in those seats to guide a conversation. If that table were right here and we had 5 seats around that table, who were 5 people that you think we would need to hear from, that we heard from in this? It can be very diverse. It's kind of like that exercise, if you could have dinner with 5 people, who would they be? But this to me is a little different. So who are some folks? For me, Angela Davis would definitely be at the table. W.E.B. Du Bois. Yeah. Yeah. Martin Luther King Jr. Okay. Kimberly Crenshaw. The Clintons. How about some, mix that up a little bit. Who, oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I would like Sojourner Truth.
Sojourner Truth?
Because it has been said that she was the first to speak from the point of view of intersectionality.
Mm-hmm.
In her speech in Akron, Ohio,
Mm-hmm.
in April of 1859,
Mm-hmm.
talked about the part and the pint. I thought that was just marvelous.
Yeah.
So can you remind us again what the topic we would be asking these people to actually discuss?
I think there could be multiple topics. So let me give you an example. And I'm gonna share 4 names of people that I think would be really interesting to have at the table. Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, Carol Denise McNair, Addie Mae Collins. You remember who those 4 are? They were the girls that were killed in the Birmingham church bombing. And that was when Angela Davis saw that in the paper, her response was, I know them. They're my friends. So that was a significant shift for her. So that exercise is something, it's a different way of imagining these conversations. And maybe we're at the table and we change the different people at the table so that we can glean understanding from them or be challenged by them, or as you said, be shunned by them. Whatever that experience is, it's a way to get into some of the lived experience of people that have been in the middle of this for a very long time. Another thing that was really critical in my understanding of this was when you mentioned W.E.B. Du Bois, his whole definition of double consciousness. And in the sense that always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One of the very moving sections of this book, there were numerous, but as someone who has experienced marginalization through sexual orientation, it was really inspiring for me to hear from Audre Lorde and from Janet Mock. Now, Janet Mock wrote a book a number of years ago as a black transgender woman called Redefining Realness. And in a way, Janet addressed this experience of double consciousness, and she described it this way. Somewhere along the way, I grew weary of grasping at possible selves just out of reach. So I put my arms down and wrapped them around me. I began healing by embracing myself through the foreboding darkness until the sunrise shone on my face. Eventually, I emerged and surrendered to the brilliance, discovering truth, beauty, and peace that was already mine. So she had to make that journey and claim that for herself against everything that was against that. So it became a praxis or a practice for her to move through that, and that's some of the work of intersectional theory. Audre Lorde, And this was in this chapter called Law and Order, which began with Ronald Reagan firing Angela Davis twice. The first time pulling the communist card, and the second time pulling the unbefitting behavior of a university professor, both of which were reversed and refuted. But this was the part of Angela Davis's journey where she really began to commit herself to racial criminal justice reform for women, for men, across the board. And within this section, there's a lot about where black LGBTQ people found themselves in terms of intersectional theory, these multiple identities, and how that showed up as kind of a new experience. And I'm just going to quote from some things that were in that section to give you some context. Black LGBTs had started to step away from women's liberation, black power, and white gay liberation movements, starting their own new integrative dance of queer anti-racism in the 1970s. Audre Lorde, and this goes back to what I said earlier about the expectation that people who are marginalized should teach us what we need to learn. Audre Lorde said, non-whites, women, and LGBTs were expected to educate whites, men, and heterosexuals to appreciate our humanity. The oppressors maintain their position and evade their responsibility for their own actions. There is a constant drain of energy which might be better used in redefining ourselves and devising realistic scenarios for altering the present and constructing the future. Now, she also did some amazing work on the power of the erotic, which if you ever want to explore that and as a point of intersectional theory and theology, it would be well worth your time. So I want to share just a little bit more about some key concepts of intersectional theory, because I think they're really significant in terms of how we look at this, not only globally, but nationally and locally. And 6 core concepts are social inequality, power, relationality, social context, complexity, and social justice. When we embrace intersectional thinking, it means that we approach our questioning, our exploration, our research by questioning assumptions that are rooted in the norms of dominant culture. So we have to look at what dominant culture is saying and question that at every turn. And within that, purposely pursue justice with its contradictions and its complexities, and decide that we're not going to do this work as usual or as the status quo. And one of the things I loved about Angela Davis and love about Angela Davis is that at every turn she was questioning the status quo. She wouldn't accept it. She was always questioning it and pushing it and challenging it, and in the process finding her way, whether it was joining the Communist Party of the USA or showing up at various protests and finding the points of connection with the protesters, and always bringing it back to how can we become anti-racist? How is what is emerging from these protests undergirding the racism that still shows up where we are, whether it was in California or New York or in the Midwest, wherever she showed up. And I really admire that about her. She just kept asking those questions and kept pushing the point. We see that struggle in our city. It's showing up in a lot of ways. One of the things that has been a real key issue for me was a discovery that I made, and I wasn't the first one to make it. It just was a new discovery for me, about 16 years ago, when I first moved to Roanoke, I happened to attend a homeless memorial service in Coiner Springs Cemetery. How many of you have ever been to Coiner Springs Cemetery? You may not even know where it is. You have to drive out 460, past Cloverdale, the light. You keep going, you turn left, and you'll see a small sign that says Coiner Springs. At the end of that drive is the Juvenile Detention Center. But before you get to that is a little signpost that says East Botetourt Cemetery. That cemetery was purchased by the city of Roanoke in the late 50s with the intention of moving bodies from the city of Roanoke from multiple locations there. And as I walked around the cemetery, I noticed some unusual things. One is there weren't a lot of individual markers. Typically, when you go into a cemetery, you see names, dates. All I saw were 3 monolithic markers, huge granite markers. And the epitaph on each marker was a city ordinance. It's quoting a city ordinance. And each one, in a different way, attempted to honor the bodies that had been moved from City Farm Cemetery, which is where Virginia Western is located. And the cemetery was around a building that still exists there. If you look up on the hill, it's an old brick building. And that used to be the Poor Farm. And Old Lick Cemetery, which is right on Orange Avenue, right across from the Civic Center. And Old Lick Cemetery, that stone indicates that over almost 1,000 bodies were moved from that cemetery and placed there. When I researched the city ordinances, it said that when the bodies were moved, they would be moved reverently, and that individual markers would be placed at each grave like they were in the original cemeteries. So if you go out to Coiner Springs, what you will quickly discover is there are 3 stones over what is essentially a mass grave for 1,300 people. There are no individual markers. And so it's been really interesting to me to go back through that history, to find out how that came into being, to go through a process of discovery to find out who was buried in Old Lick Cemetery, who was moved, who was buried in City Farm, who was moved, to find a way to reclaim those names and to honor the people. And it was a mixture of white and black people. I would say it was predominantly black or African American people. I've learned recently that Old Lick Cemetery really, I think the city stopped encouraging burials there in the 30s, mid-40s, but it was clear that people continued to bury loved ones there. And so for me, that has become an area of passion and interest, because I think as we explore that history, we learn more about ourselves and we learn more about some of the systemic aspects of racism that were a part of our history and in many ways still are a part of our system and our institution. And so when I think about Ibram Kendi's call, and he describes it in the epilogue, it's where I find myself today. He says, any effective solution to eradicating American racism must involve Americans committed to anti-racist policies and maintaining power over institutions, neighborhoods, counties, states, and nations, or the world. Anti-racists merely have to have intelligent self-interest to stop consuming those racist ideas that have engendered so much unintelligent self-interest over the years. And he invites us to become principled anti-racists. And that's really important to me. And one of the ways he says we can do that is to not do the old strategies, which are self-sacrifice, uplift suasion, and educational persuasion. And he explains those pretty thoroughly in the epilogue, so I won't go into the specifics on that. But that's kind of an overview of where my journey is right now, some of the intersections that I experience, how those show up in local government, and the kind of work I want to dedicate myself to. So I don't know how we are on time, if I have more time or if I've run over.
Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah.
What is our city doing to deal with these issues?
Well, it's multi-layered. I would say that our council right now is very dedicated to opening some of this up and asking questions and exploring some resolutions to it. Part of the reality I think that many in the city are experiencing is there are issues that when they're discussed or addressed, at their root is urban renewal and the history of urban renewal and the trauma of that. And the challenge becomes how to acknowledge and honor that trauma and also find ways to move and work together for transformation in the city. And that's really challenging. It's very difficult. Bob and Bill and I have actually been meeting with a group of elders in the community to look at some of those core issues and how we can work on them together. And that's been very challenging. But it's real, it's honest. I appreciate that we've been able to be at a table together and to continue to have those conversations. We have to keep showing up and really pushing each other and challenging each other, and that's very difficult work. But it's important because it's the only way ultimately that we can become anti-racist. I think one of the things Kendi says in here is that, and I probably won't get this right, but I'm going to try. He essentially says none of us will be free until black people are free of racism. It's something like that. We have to start there. Because everybody since then, Asian Americans, Korean Americans, anyone who has come here, native, indigenous people, if we don't start at the root, then we'll never cure or heal any of the rest of it. And another piece of that that's shown up, and Sharon, I think you spoke at the Episcopal, yeah, it was the Trail of Tears 400th anniversary. The Episcopal Church of the Diocese of Southwest Virginia, the Episcopal Church, did a series of events across the state of Virginia to raise awareness and education about incidents of racism that happened throughout the state. And when in Roanoke, we talked about two horrific lynchings that happened in 1892, William Lavender, and 1894, Thomas Smith. And in both cases, it was mob violence at the hand of white men predominantly, but we also know there were women and children involved in that. There was no justice. I don't believe there was ever a hearing or any due process for either of them. One of them was attacked initially by a small group of men and essentially burned on a pyre and then lynched on a tree down by the Roanoke River near the Wasena Bridge. And the other was pulled out of the jail and dragged on the street up to the corner of Franklin and Mountain. And there's a vacant lot right there on that corner, and he was lynched there. So these are some things that are a part of Roanoke's history that many people have no idea happened. But they're part of the pain and trauma of racism in our city. And part of the way we get to the root is that we uproot those stories and we talk about them and we bring them into the conversation and we figure out how we can address them in transformative ways.
So, as Joe was sitting at the table, I'm sure those are very challenging conversations at times, but are there going to be opportunities of things that not just our civic leaders, but that the rest of us could participate in?
Certainly, and I would say one of the things that happened this last year that for people who were able to participate that I think was very significant was a project called Changing the Narrative. And that came about through a grant from the Kellogg Foundation to 6 localities in 6 cities in Virginia who have a pretty awful history of racism. And the whole initiative was designed to create opportunities for people to talk about the history of racism and work toward ways of building new relationships, discovering new things about each other, creating those kinds of conversations, and hopefully solutions that can lead to resolution and reconciliation and racial healing. And Katie, right here, and Points of Diversity actually served as the agency that directed that. And I think their hope is that those kinds of efforts can continue.